Jim in Canada. Dear Dr. Craig, I have a question regarding the Trinity and the impossibility of crossing an actual infinite. If interactions between the persons are infinite, how does God ever, for example, process all of the thoughts that have passed between the persons to the point of making a decision, such as creating the universe? Even if the interactions occur outside of created time, they would still seem to be a sequence of real events and a real infinite generated by the persons in God's being. Does God's unity or some other attribute play into this? I found your arguments about infinity is helpful in dealing with Buddhist statements about an infinite universe and infinite past lives, but I can see a Buddhist eventually raising this question in response, so I would appreciate your thoughts. I've been searching for information, but so far I've found nothing directly addressing this issue.
I'd refer Jim to my book, Time and Eternity. I have discussed this issue at some length, and that would be one place where he could get some additional resources on it. I think that the difficulty is Jim's presupposition that interactions between the persons of the Trinity have to be sequential. He just assumes that they occur one after another. And classical Christian theology denies that. Traditional theology interprets God to be timeless, and therefore the persons of the Trinity experience a complete sharing and interpenetration of knowledge, love, and will. The Greek church fathers called this perichoresis, this complete sharing and interchange of knowledge, love, and will among the persons of the Trinity that isn't sequential. It's simply that what the Father knows, the Son and the Spirit also know. What the Father loves, the Son and the Spirit also love. What the Father wills, the Son and the Spirit also will. So there's a complete transparency here among the persons of the Trinity, which is why, by the way, God is not lonely in his state of existence, being without the universe. He doesn't need finite persons for fellowship. God is tripersonal. And therefore, the idea of an infinite regress of mental states in the being of God simply doesn't come into question. You get back to a state of timelessness in which God exists sans creation, or without the world.
A question from Torrance in the U.S. Dr. Craig says, Dear Dr. Craig, to begin, I want to thank you for all your endeavors aimed at equipping Christians with the tools for defending the faith. You've been a tremendous help to me as well as to my brother, who was struggling to find answers regarding our faith. Because of what I learned from you, I was able to persuade him to continue holding out in his faith long enough for the Holy Spirit to do the rest. I'm thrilled to say that he is now a believer again. Praise the Lord, and thank you, sir. My question concerns an objection to the Kalam cosmological argument that I encountered from a friend. In short, it targets the version of the Kalam which uses as support for premise 2 the argument for the impossibility of an actual infinite. I myself think that this argument, if successful, is even stronger support for 2 than contemporary cosmology, which is subject to contingent scientific findings. The objection, here paraphrased, is short and simple. If actual infinities cannot exist, then why do apologists continually assert that there was a singularity of infinite density in the finite past? Isn't the singularity itself an example of an actual infinite and therefore unable to exist, if their reasoning about infinities is indeed correct? I think that an infinite density may be odd because infinite density is merely a finite mass divided by a volume of 0, whereas, for example, an infinite mass, should it exist, will look something like 1g plus 1g plus 1g and onward to infinity. Is this enough to show that the infinite density of the singularity is different from the actual infinities which you argue do not exist?
I thank Torrance for this question, and I'm thrilled for his brother. I also like the philosophical arguments and look at the scientific evidence as simply confirmation of a conclusion that philosophical arguments for the beginning of the universe already lead to. Now, with respect to his question, I would say, along with most cosmologists, that the singularity of infinite density is merely a mathematical idealization. It is the point at which all space-time shrink down to literally nothing at all, and that therefore this is not an actual physical state of reality. It's a mere mathematical idealization. And his point about dividing a finite mass by zero yielding infinity is a good example that illustrates this. This is exactly the point that my friend Quentin Smith makes in dealing with the question of the infinite density of the singularity. He says it's simply a mathematical artifact of the division by zero is impossible. You divide something by zero and the answer is infinity. And it's in that sense that the universe, having a zero volume, regardless of its mass, the density becomes infinite. So I would say that this state of infinite density is not a state that is a physical state that actually exists. It's merely a mathematical idealization of the contraction of the universe as you go back in time to its ideal mathematical limit.
Bill, would the philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past predict that science will never discover an eternal universe? I mean, if it's impossible.
Not necessarily, Kevin. I've thought of this too. It seems to me that the finitude of the past is something that is verifiable, but it's not falsifiable. Why do I say that? Well, because if God created the universe, say, through a Big Bang, modern science could come to verify that the past is not infinite, that the past is only finite. It's a verifiable prediction. But it might not be falsifiable because God could have created a steady-state universe out of nothing a finite time ago. And so it would have the appearance of being eternal, but in fact it wouldn't be. So I do think that the finitude of the past is something that you could verify, but it's not necessarily falsifiable.
I understand that answer, Bill. It could bring up this issue of God creating something with the appearance of X.
Exactly. The idea that I suggested of God's creating a steady-state universe at some point in the finite past would involve creating a universe with the appearance of age when in fact it's actually young. And some young Earth creationists have actually adopted that hypothesis with respect to explaining the apparent age of the universe. So that can have the look of desperation about it. And if you're not willing to say that God could or would create something with the appearance, the mere appearance of age, then it would turn out that the hypothesis of a universe with a beginning would be falsifiable.
That is really problematic when you start having God create things with the appearance of age, isn't it? Because it tends to make God a deceiver in a sense.
And he could have created the universe then 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age, and we'd never know the difference.
Good verse on this for Christians is Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. And so the universe is giving us knowledge. And the appearance of age would not be knowledge of something.
Right. That's right. So, it would be, deception or misleading at best. But in any case, the beginning of the universe in any case would certainly be verifiable by modern science and would therefore even pass the most stringent requirements of the verification principle.
Question from Fraser in the UK. Dear Dr. Craig, first of all, I would like to thank you for your ministry, as your defense of Christianity has been very encouraging for myself and many of my friends. My questions concern both premises of the Kalam cosmological argument as you defended it. Of course, premise one, everything that begins to exist has a cause. It seems to me that this premise is unjustified, as this is not the causal principle we see in the world. It seems to me that the only causal relations we see in the world are ones that change the orientation of existing entities. For example, when someone fashions a chair out of wood, this is not really a chair coming into being, but a rearrangement of the pre-existing wood. Following this train of thought, it seems as though whenever we see something coming into existence, it is really just a rearrangement of the fundamental constituent quarks and leptons. How then are you justified in saying that this first premise is true when it has never been observed and does not bear any relation to the normal causal principle at work. Say, when a tea bag is placed into hot water, it causes the cup of tea to change from being a cup of boiling water into a cup of tea.
All right, this is a question that we have addressed over and over again, but it seems the lesson is difficult to learn and it keeps coming up. So let me say something about it again. He misinterprets the first premise to be saying that everything that begins to exist ex nihilo has a cause, that everything that begins to exist out of nothing has a cause. And that's not at all what the first premise is talking about. It's just talking about something that begins to exist. And I would disagree with Fraser when he says that a chair doesn't really come into being. That is patently false. When a carpenter makes a chair out of pre-existing wood, the chair comes into existence at that point. It begins to exist. If you deny that, then I would ask you to tell me, where was the chair before the carpenter began to do his work? Has that chair been around? If so, why haven't we seen it? Or think of your own existence. Did you exist prior to your conception? If so, where were you then before your parents met? Where were you during the Jurassic Age when the dinosaurs were about? It's patently obvious that things begin to exist. And this premise doesn't require that they begin to exist out of nothing. Indeed, the premise is quite consistent with the cause being either a material cause or an efficient cause. Now, I was thinking of efficient causes when I enunciated the premise. Everything that begins to exist must have an efficient cause. The chair that begins to exist must have a carpenter who makes it. The person who begins to exist must have parents who conceive him. But it's entirely compatible with saying that there needs to be material causes as well. Wood out of which the chair is made, sperm and egg out of which the person is conceived. So this first premise is entirely open with respect to the nature of the cause. It simply says that everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. And I don't think Fraser would want to deny that. I think he would agree with it. The question is, when you get to the case of the universe began to exist, the argument proves that the universe has a cause. Now, the question is, what kind of cause is it? Is it an efficient cause? Or is it a material cause? And here it clearly cannot be a material cause because the beginning of the universe involves the beginning, the origin of all matter and energy. All matter and energy come to exist at the beginning of the universe. And therefore the cause of the universe that the argument concludes to cannot be a material cause. It can be, at best, an efficient cause. So there's simply no problem here with the premise. The premise is supported by both philosophical argument and the best of inductive evidence, and there's simply no reason to think that this premise is unjustified.
And you pointed out that this principle is a metaphysical principle.
Yes, that's why I said there are philosophical arguments and not just inductive evidence for this premise. I find it odd that folks are so focused on the inductive evidence that as you look around, everything that begins to exist has a cause. But they don't seem to grasp the metaphysical principle that is at issue here, and that is that things don't just spring into being from nothing. They need to have a cause of some sort that brings them into existence, whether it's efficient or material or formal or final. Some sort of cause has to explain why something like a chair or a person begins to exist. So I think the metaphysical arguments or considerations for this premise are far more important than the inductive evidence, though the inductive evidence does support the premise.
Yeah, the objector usually says something along the lines of, prior to the universe's creation, since there were no physical laws or things like that, then all bets are off, and you can't apply number one.
That's a different objection, and that is assuming, as you say, that the causal principle is merely like a law of nature, a physical law, like the second law of thermodynamics or Boyle's gas laws or something of that sort. But it's not a physical principle